Doctor Josep Garrell, rector magnífic de la Universitat Ramon Llull, honorable senyora Lourdes Ciuró, consellera de Justícia de la Generalitat de Catalunya, doctora Miriam Diez, directora de la Càtedra de Llibertat Religiosa i de Consciència, senyora Hble, directora general d'Afers Religiosos de la Generalitat de Catalunya, honorable senyor Germà Gordó, exconseller de Justícia, honorable senyora Àngels Chacón, exconsellera d'Empresa i Coneixement, doctor Carlo Galucci, vicerrector d'Estudiants i Relacions Internacionals de la Universitat Ramon Llull, doctor Agustí Alcoberro, vicerrector de Patrimoni i Activitats Culturals de la Universitat de Barcelona, senyor Gali, comissionat de Diàleg Intercultural i Pluralisme Religiós de l'Ajuntament de Barcelona, senyora Inés Mazarrasa, directora de la Fundació Pluralismo i Convivència, doctor Carles Llinàs, degà de la Facultat de Filosofia de la Universitat Ramon Llull, doctor Joan Andreu Rocha, degà de la Facultat Pere Tarrés de la Universitat Ramon Llull, doctor Joan Torra, degà de la Facultat de Teologia de la Universitat Ramon Llull, representants del món universitari, representants de l'àmbit religiós, representants de l'àmbit sanitari, professores, professors, estudiants, senyores i senyors, siguin molt benvinguts en aquest acte inaugural del primer Congrés Internacional de la Càtedra de Llibertat Religiosa i de Consciència de Catalunya. Estem aquí a la Facultat de Comunicació i Relacions Internacionals Blanquerna i en els propers 2 dies acollirem xerrades, presentacions, ponències, compartirem bones experiències, diàlegs, debats sobre aquest dret fonamental. Abans de passar la paraula a la nostra taula inaugural, algunes indicacions logístiques. Aquest acte inicial, inaugural, serà en català. Tenen al fons de la sala auriculars per traducció simultània, per tant poden fer-lo servir en el moment que considerin. La taula redona posterior, que està configurada per 4 membres del nostre Consell Assessor, serà en anglès, per tant també poden fer servir el servei de traducció simultània en el moment que el necessitin. D'altra banda, tenen el programa amb els diferents panels que aniran tenint lloc avui, aquest matí, aquesta tarda i demà al matí. Tot passa en aquest edifici de la biblioteca, segon i tercer pis. Quan vegin que les aules tenen el número 2 en el seu nom, són al segon pis, el número 3 són al tercer pis. A partir de les 11 del matí tindran també un cafè aquí a fora, a les portes de l'auditori, per tant també podran descansar i compartir una mica amb la resta d'assistents les primeres impressions d'aquest congrés. Sense més, donem la paraula al doctor Josep Garrell, rector de la Universitat Ramon Llull.
Gràcies, consellera, directora de la Càtedra, autoritats, senyores i senyors. Bon dia a tothom. Benvinguts a aquest primer congrés Internacional de Llibertat Religiosa i de Consciència que convoca la Càtedra del mateix nom i la Direcció General d'Afers Religiosos. Una salutació especial als anteriors consellers que avui ens acompanyen, el conseller de Justícia i la consellera d'Empresa i Coneixement. Gràcies per acompanyar-nos avui aquí. A very special welcome to those of you that came from abroad. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for being part of this first International Conference on Freedom of Religion and Belief. If I'm not wrong, there are experts, the conference gathers experts from 29 different countries, people that came from Africa, from Asia, from America, and of course people from Europe. So thank you very much for being here today. I will spend just 1 minute talking about our university, Ramon Llull University. We know that the name of the university, Ramon Llull, and especially Llull, is a very complicated name to pronounce, but you can try it. The conference will take place mainly in this building. This building is the library of our Faculty of Communications and International Relations at Blanquerna. In fact, this is one of the 12 faculties of the university. Our university is a medium-sized comprehensive university, and by medium-size I mean that we have roughly 22,000 students. More than 21% of those students came from other countries, came from abroad. If I'm not wrong, and here is the Vice Rector for International Affairs, our international community comes from more than 110 different countries, so it's all around the world. And as our Vice Rector said, when a university has 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 5 students that came from abroad, the university needs to be understood a little bit different. I am talking about diversity, that always is richness. Talking about university priorities, of course, quality of education, quality of the learning and teaching process is one of the top of our priorities. Also, quality of research, always linked to innovation, always seeking impact, and of course, social engagement in general. From a legal point of view, our university is a private non-for-profit foundation, and from the organizational perspective, the university gathers in a federation 9 different higher education institutions that already exist before the creation of the university, and Blanquerna is one of them. So our governance represents a quite unique experience about leadership in the university ecosystem, but after 31 years of the foundation, I need to say that the model is working. Just let me end saying that the Faculty of Communication and International Relations, the center that holds the chair of freedom of religion and belief, is one of the most active, one of the most dynamic centers of the university. And also, and I am going to talk a little bit later in these opening remarks, and also the center is one of our champions in the needed university mission of social engagement. And I am completely sure that it is not for random. In fact, I am completely sure that it is due to the excellent team that is leading the center. Always is a teamwork. But let me just thank Professor Diez for being part of this, for being an active part of this story. Thank you very much, Miriam. And as I was told that is a simultaneous translation service, I'm going to switch to Catalan for the rest of these opening remarks. Com deia, aquest congrés està organitzat per la càtedra amb el suport, amb la col·laboració, de fet, m'atreviria a dir amb la coorganització del Departament de Justícia i a través de la Direcció General d'Afers Religiosos. Per tant, moltíssimes gràcies, consellera, moltíssimes gràcies, directora general, pel suport, per estar avui aquí. És evident que la vostra presència dona rellevància política al fet del que avui anem a fer. Aquest congrés va de drets. I de fet, si recordem la pròpia Declaració de Drets Humans, l'article 18, diu, i llegeixo textualment, tota persona té dret a la llibertat de pensament, tota persona té dret a la llibertat de consciència, tota persona té dret a la llibertat de religió. Per tant, durant aquests 2 dies vostès parlaran de drets amb un programa que francament és altament atractiu. No m'atreviré pas, seria una imprudència parlar del contingut de la conferència, a pesar que els rectors ens fan inaugurar diferents coses i sempre s'espera que parlis del contingut, no ho faré, però sí que no vull deixar passar aquesta oportunitat de poder parlar amb vostès per compartir algunes reflexions, evidentment, de l'entorn universitari i del que ens ocupa. Veiem en els darrers mesos la brutal agressió de Rússia a Ucraïna i potser aquest fet ens ha fet prendre consciència que no és pas l'únic conflicte violent, l'únic conflicte armat arreu del món, n'hi ha molts altres. I no se m'acut un exemple més dramàtic que una guerra com un exemple de vulneració de tots tipus de dret, començant pel dret a la vida, em sembla evident. Però la vulneració de drets és pràcticament sistemàtica arreu del món. Si miren qualsevol indicador de l'evolució d'això que es pot dir la qualitat democràtica, veuran d'una manera completament alarmant que després d'un cert període de millora continuada, a partir d'allà, i ja portem pràcticament 2 dècades, la qualitat democràtica, tots els indicadors de qualitat democràtica arreu del món i també en això que n'hi diem Occident, es van degradant, es van alarmantment degradant. Un augment dramàtic de la polarització, del populisme, dels extremismes, un augment de la intolerància, i això té efectes tant a curt com a mig com a llarg termini. Aquesta setmana també amb el vicerector assistíem a la presentació d'una de les presentacions, de fet, de l'informe FOS que fa Càritas Diocesana de Barcelona, i ens parlaven de quin és el risc d'exclusió social de les famílies a Catalunya. A Catalunya, en comparació a la resta de l'Estat, a Catalunya ratllem el 30%. És a dir, pràcticament una de cada 3 famílies té risc d'exclusió social, una xifra que és la més alta de tot l'estat espanyol. I el problema és l'evolució que ha tingut en els darrers temps. Molt probablement aquesta polarització que els deia, aquesta violació sistemàtica de drets, aquest deixar fer, és el que també té aquest tipus d'impactes tan a curt termini. Si parlem d'això que en diem Occident, possiblement tots veiem amb certa incredulitat això que en podríem dir l'efecte Trump als Estats Units, la violació de drets de tot tipus a Turquia, a Hongria, i això estem parlant de la Unió Europea, estem parlant del cor d'Europa, etc. Jo diria que bona part de tot allò que donàvem per sentat, allò que donàvem per garantit, això que n'hi dèiem l'estat del benestar en genèric, està en risc, i està en risc d'una manera important. I no estic parlant dels grans reptes, dels grans desafiaments que té la humanitat en general, és a dir, tot el que és el relatiu a l'Agenda 2030, el canvi climàtic, la sostenibilitat, etc. Aquest és un congrés essencialment acadèmic, essencialment universitari, tot que està evidentment obert a moltíssima gent, i crec que és pertinent fer-nos la pregunta de què és el que podríem fer des de les universitats. Si alguna cosa a les universitats podem fer, si amb alguna cosa podem generar impacte, és precisament en l'educació. Si creiem que l'educació té una capacitat de transformació tremendament important, el que hem de preguntar-nos és com hem de fer l'educació, en aquest cas l'educació superior universitària, com hem d'educar precisament per reduir tots aquests riscos dels quals he estat parlant. Tenim des de les universitats la responsabilitat, jo diria l'obligació, d'educar o de contribuir a l'educació de ciutadans compromesos. Parlo, en definitiva, de gent que posi el bé comú pel davant d'altres coses. Tenim també la responsabilitat de no tancar-nos amb nosaltres mateixos. Les universitats acostumen a ser llocs relativament tancats. En uns països és una mica diferent dels altres. Tenim l'obligació de ser institucions socialment compromeses i traslladar-ho en el nostre dia a dia. De fet, ara fa aproximadament un any i mig es va publicar un informe de l'Associació Europea d'Universitats en el qual s'intentava visualitzar el sector a una dècada vista. I, de fet, les conclusions del propi informe van canviar el títol, i el títol de l'informe finalment es va dir University Without Walls. Crec que està tot dit. La visió que es té des del sector pel mateix sector a una dècada vista és universitats sense parets, universitats sense murs, que en el fons vol dir moltes coses, però una de les coses que vol dir és que les institucions hem d'estar socialment compromeses. Probablement mai la humanitat s'havia afrontat a reptes d'aquesta magnitud i, per tant, probablement mai les universitats havíem tingut pel davant tantíssima feina a fer. Jo els convido a abordar la temàtica d'aquesta conferència, la llibertat religiosa, la llibertat de consciència, des de, lògicament, el rigor acadèmic, però sense oblidar, que vull dir, tenint molt i molt present la societat a la que servim, la societat per la qual treballem des de les institucions d'educació superior. Els convido a arribar a conclusions i que aquestes surtin d'aquestes parets, surtin d'aquests murs, transcendeixin a la societat, que també serveixin aquestes conclusions per informar polítiques públiques, que posin això que deia del bé comú com a primeríssima oportunitat i que siguin veritablement útils. Estic completament segur que serà així. I acabo com he començat, agraint la presència de la Consellera en aquest acte, de la Directora General d'Afers Religiosos. Creiem que tenim conjuntament, i ens agrada dir-ho conjuntament, un gran projecte entre mans, que és aquesta càtedra, amb el suport del Departament. Crec que és un dels bons exemples de la potència d'això que n'hi podríem dir el partenariat públic-privat. Sempre dic que Catalunya és un país petit en el qual no podem permetre'ns el luxe de desaprofitar cap ni una de les oportunitats, cap ni un dels nostres potencials. Així que moltíssimes gràcies de nou i que tinguin un bon congrés durant aquests dies.
Donem ara la paraula a la doctora Miriam Diez, directora de la Càtedra de Llibertat Religiosa i de Consciència.
Ladies and gentlemen, religious freedom has brought us all together here, and also the ones who are following us through streaming, our colleagues and our friends. It means that we are interested in human rights, it means that we're interested in religion, and it reveals that we want a better world, and that we work intensively for that. Therefore, we are very happy to welcome you here. We thank you for your time, also for your expertise, because we expect discussions, fruitful ones, among you. We have prepared this conference with full of spare time for you to interact and to network. And we think it's important, not only papers and papers and papers. We need more synergies, and we need more partners, and we need to work together for the religious freedom. We do, as the rector said, we do understand university not only as a place for teaching and research, this is good, but also a place for public, fruitful debates. And we really need more public debates, and we need religion to be in these debates, and we need ethical concerns, and we need humanitarian concerns to be on the plate. Democracy needs to strengthen its value, remembering that freedom of religion and belief are fundamental rights. Fundamental rights, not optional rights. Fundamental. Religion does exist, and religion configures the life of millions of people and gives sense of hope and gives sense of faithful people. So we stand for that, and we stand for that academically, professionally, politically, sociologically, and publicly. We want religion in the public sphere as well. Why you are here? The rector explained what Ramon Llull University is. This is the faculty, the School for International Relations and Communication, and 1.5 years ago, we settled here the chair for religious freedom and belief within the Observatory on Religion, Media, and Culture. And we did that with the willingness of the General Directorate for Religious Affairs from the Catalan government, from the Justice Department. And we co-created that together, and we are very proud of that, and we are very responsible for that. Religions are part of our society, and in Catalonia we have a government that acknowledges that fact. And this is not the case in many other countries in the world, and we like to say it, and to say it loud. To say it loud. Religion is part of our culture, religion is part of our society. You are an example of that. We are an example of that. This is our first conference on religious freedom and belief, and we have prepared it as an agora for exchange. The conference is the first opportunity after COVID restrictions to have a global gathering like this, and our plan is to have this conference every 2 years. So put it in your agenda, every 2 years here with us. We are people of hope, but we are aware that the situation of religious freedom in terms of that has not improved all over the world, has not improved. On the contrary, many threats are menacing this right, a lot. We will hear voices from persecuted persons, but we will also hear positive and emerging good practices. Because interreligious dialogue, intercultural dialogue is also a strength of Catalan people, and we want to share it, and we will also to learn from other places in the world. We stand for a world in which believers and non-believers, because remember that we also need to defend the right not to believe. Believers and non-believers could coexist peacefully. Peacefully. We are not islands, and we would like Blanquerna to be the land of this debate, a fruitful land, a positive one, in which we could listen to each other, in which we could also share not only knowledge, but also experiences. One last word to remember our friend and board member who passed away 1 month ago, Leonie. Leonie Lewis was a very good friend and colleague of this chair. We terribly miss her loss. We wished she was here with us. we think she is, in another light, in a different way, for the best of our conference. Thank you again. Very welcome in our house. This is your house. Thank you.
I per obrir i inaugurar oficialment aquest congrés, honorable senyora Lourdes Ciuró, consellera de Justícia de la Generalitat de Catalunya, la convidem al faristol. Gràcies.
Bon dia, magnífic rector, directora, autoritats. Good morning and welcome you all today here at this conference. En primer lloc, felicitats a la Universitat Ramon Llull i gràcies per permetre'ns col·laborar amb vosaltres des de la Direcció General d'Afers Religiosos en l'organització d'aquest congrés. Un congrés que ho dieu bé, és sobre llibertat religiosa, sobre llibertat de consciència, en definitiva, sobre la defensa dels drets humans. En això ens tindreu al costat, perquè respectem des del Departament de Justícia del Govern de Catalunya, protegim qui té creences, qui no les té, i el dret a vetllar i a reivindicar el coneixement i la feina en comú per traslladar aquesta diversitat que és el nostre país i que en definitiva ens fa forts en el progrés. Quan col·laborem, ho ha dit el rector, ho ha dit també la directora, aquest és el nostre compromís com a govern. Serà aquest un espai de debat, un espai molt interessant on compartireu coneixement, sobretot experiències, menys papers, com diu la directora, i més experiències compartides d'èxit, més casos d'èxit per evidenciar com es pateix la persecució per part d'algunes persones per la manera que senten o pensen i com des de les societats, amb aquest partenariat ineludible entre la cosa pública, que és la institució del Govern de Catalunya, i la cosa més privada, en aquest cas el coneixement, poden participar per ajudar a que la convivència, el respecte, la tolerància, el coneixement, en definitiva, millorin el progrés i la cohesió socials. Per tant, molt fan d'aquesta col·laboració. L'hem de repetir perquè la universitat, deia la directora, ha de ser un espai de portes obertes per filtrar, i també ho deia el rector, per incorporar coneixement, però sobretot les institucions ens hem de nodrir de l'expertesa, del coneixement, de la transferència de coneixement, perquè és des d'aquestes càtedres, des d'aquestes universitats, on analitzeu, on implementeu noves pràctiques, on assageu, on compartiu, i en definitiva les conclusions d'aquesta feina que feu i que només vosaltres sabeu fer d'aquesta manera ens pot beneficiar en definitiva en la gestió de les polítiques públiques. Un congrés, una convenció, aquesta sobre drets, sobre llibertats, sobre drets fonamentals, sobre llibertat religiosa i de consciència, que ha tingut un èxit de convocatòria esclatant. Persones dels 5 continents seran presents de via telemàtica o via presencial, i aquí el que fareu és abordar, com dèiem, aquest dret fonamental, com garantir-lo des de tots els àmbits, també social, sanitari, educatiu, cultural. El repte és, doncs, majúscul, amb unes societats cada vegada més canviants, cada vegada més plurals, cada vegada més globals, cada vegada que tendeixen a la homogenització, a apartar la mirada de la diferència per tendir a fer les polítiques per la majoria. Aquí és quan les diferents realitats tenen l'exercici imprescindible de reivindicar-se, de mantenir-se, de treballar per donar-se a conèixer i per lluitar, per dir que la diferència, que la pluralitat és el que dèiem la clau de societats fortes i societats de progrés. No és de rebut que hi hagin persecucions per formes de creença o per formes d'estimar o per formes de sentir o per color de pell, tampoc pel cas de les llengües que es parlen. Les llengües són una riquesa pels països, el català és la llengua pròpia de Catalunya, i agrair el compromís de la Universitat Ramon Llull en aquesta llengua d'ús científic que sempre heu mostrat. Una llengua ha de ser també, igual que la religió, una eina de cohesió social i una eina d'evolució en tots els camps de la vida. Si una llengua se l'exclou d'un dels camps, ja sigui cultural, ja sigui científic, ja sigui social, ja sigui jurídic, aquesta llengua perilla. Per tant, gràcies per l'esforç que com a universitat feu una reivindicació de la llengua pròpia de Catalunya i, per tant, el rebuig a la persecució sistemàtica de l'ús d'aquesta llengua que patim constantment i que des del govern tenim el compromís de defensar i de lluitar perquè no sigui així, perquè és entès, ja us dic, com a eina de progrés i de cohesió social. Aquest primer congrés, a més, si em permeteu, situa el nostre país, Catalunya, en un lloc capdavanter, també en l'abordatge d'aquestes qüestions religioses, perquè podem parlar de tot, perquè volem parlar de tot, perquè volem visibilitzar que hi ha religions, que n'hi ha moltes, i a més, a Catalunya som un país que té un mapa religiós que acull 7.400 centres de culte de 14 confessions religioses diferents. Si tenim en compte que som un país de 7,5 milions d'habitants, com podem veure, el sentiment i el fet religiós és present al nostre dia a dia i com a tal l'hem de reconèixer, respectar i vetllar per les bones pràctiques i per la col·laboració interreligiosa. Des del govern defensem aquest article 18 que deia el magnífic rector de la Declaració dels Drets Humans, de la Declaració Universal de Drets Humans, i també l'exercim amb força, amb contundència i amb entusiasme des de fa anys. L'any 2000, la Generalitat de Catalunya va crear aquesta Direcció General d'Afers Religiosos, perquè teníem clar que al segle XXI s'havia d'afrontar, sens dubte, tenint en compte aquesta normalitat, aquella que reconeix i accepta la diversitat religiosa, la llibertat de consciència, de diàleg i sobretot enfortint el diàleg interreligiós per cohesionar la nostra societat. Aquest camí, a més, tenim molt clar que no el podem fer sols, no el podem fer des de la Direcció General i prou. Us necessitem a vosaltres, les universitats, els centres de coneixement i de talent, necessitem les diferents confessions religioses, necessitem la societat civil, per tant, benvinguts i molt celebrats debats com el del dia d'avui perquè ens apropen encara més a l'objectiu, que és el de la convivència i el de la cohesió. Mirant enrere s'han fet molta feina en aquests últims 20 anys i fruit d'aquest treball conjunt tenim avui als nostres carrers tota aquesta diversitat que, com us deia, volem preservar. Ens queda, però, molt camí per córrer. Veiem cada dia des de la Direcció General qüestions inaudites pel fet de tenir una determinada religió, un determinat rictus o unes determinades tradicions. I aquest desconeixement ens diu que hem de seguir aprofundint amb el treball bilateral amb els diferents departaments de la Generalitat i amb el treball també bilateral amb la societat civil per anar explicant, que s'entengui, que es respecti aquells trets diferencials que cada religió, que cada creença pot manifestar o vol manifestar o inclús amb la seva forma d'indumentària perquè mai ningú pugui ser assenyalat per la seva indumentària. L'acollida a Catalunya, com els deia, des de fa segles que la practiquem, som un país, una terra d'acollida i ho volem seguir sent, perquè tots i cadascun de nosaltres hem de poder viure en plenitud, perquè no entenem aquesta Catalunya nostra sense la cohesió, sense la solidaritat i sense el respecte per fer una societat de progrés en la Catalunya, en el món del segle XXI. Moltes gràcies, inaugurem el Congrés i molts èxits.
Moltes gràcies, membres de la taula inaugural. I ara sí, després d'aquestes paraules d'obertura, donem el tret de sortida al Congrés i a la primera taula rodona que tindrà lloc aquí mateix, en aquest auditori, en pocs minuts. Endavant. Gràcies.
So we're going to be very precise. Oops. We will begin our roundtable. No, it's not. So we will begin our. No, stop. No. Hello? Now. So I just ask you if you could sit down. I know that we all want coffee. Coffee will arrive in 1 hour. 1 hour. So we will begin now our roundtable. I have the privilege to present you 4 very important persons. Very difficult to get them in one table, but in Blanquerna we achieve it. So we are very happy to have you here. Alexandra Zurich, she's from the Institute of Balkan Studies of the Serbian Academy of Arts and Sciences. She's a scholar. We'll then have Dr. Petkov, Law and International Relations Program, University of Oxford. Professor Marco Ventura, University of Siena, and Professor Dr. Cyril Hoverun, Stockholm School of Theology, University College, Stockholm. They are going to have a moment, each one, to make the state of art of how they envisage religious freedom. I will just sit down here. My micro is not working, so they are taking the floor. And if you have any question afterwards, feel free to raise your hand, and I will be attentive to that. So, with no further introduction, Professor Alexandra Zurich, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Miriam. First of all, good morning to everyone. It is really a great pleasure and honor to be here today at this first international conference on the freedom of religion and belief. And I would like to congratulate and to thank Professor Bosch for invitation and organization of this remarkable event. And my intervention today will be a bit from an anthropological perspective, as being anthropologist of religion and working on the issues of religious minorities, mostly in the Balkans, for the past 15 years. I would like to address the perspective of the state of the art about religious freedom from a tentative title, Rethinking about Freedom of Religion and Belief, Increasing Awareness of Indirect Discrimination in European Societies. And from the second half of the 20th century, relations between religion, between freedom of religion and accommodation of religious diversity has appeared to be at the forefront of the political and scholarly debates, especially in Western Europe, which was also the result of the post-Second World War migration flows, but also the emergence of new religious movements. In different parts of Europe, this religious diversity has been accommodated in different ways. The question about the place of religions in secular societies especially created and still create long and ongoing debates. In relation to diversity and freedom of religion, we should not assume without empirical inquiry that establishing of existing state relation connections are barrier to multi-faith equality and should be dissembled. We should underline that the separation of religion and state is not a neutral view about religion, but it is a very definite one. In that regard, some of the essential questions are how religious identities can form the basis of discrimination where they become negatively ascribed identities, as well as how religious identities are closely tied to a person's sense of dignity, respect, and self-identity. The key influence of rethinking the freedom of religion and belief in the past decades have had migration flows, which had an important role in creating more heterogeneous and diverse religious landscapes of the European societies. And this more and more heterogeneous religious structure leads to rethinking and questioning of the existing normative frameworks in many nation states, as well as the boundaries between the public and the private, whereby the right to religious freedom could be in a collision with the normative framework of the freedom of religion. More complex religious landscape and emergence of new religious identities, which did not exist in particular regions or area, had a significant impact on societal response when it comes to the questions of inclusion, tolerance, and anti-discrimination. Therefore, the challenges of post-immigration and increased ethno-religious diversity is especially evident in the last years with the influx of refugees and migrants to European societies coming from the Middle East. Even though on a declarative level, if we could say that, whereby equal rights for religious communities are often granted, on the practical or on the secondary level, there are numerous obstacles which indicate that inequality and discrimination of minority religious communities exist. Some of the key questions that arise are: is it the moment for rethinking the freedom of religion and accommodation of religious diversity? How can we go beyond the declarative discourse of non-discrimination and raise awareness on many particularities of very often present indirect discrimination? What are the possible areas of positive inclusivity through identity recognition? And overcoming indirect religious discrimination, or a stage whereby all religious communities appear to have an equal status, but on the second level, members of many religious minority groups encounter serious limitations of the freedom of religion in practice. Therefore, I would like to briefly underline some of the possible areas of presence of indirect discrimination and the ways of overcoming it. Indirect discrimination can also be a consequence of the legal instruments which are often created from the perspective of majority or traditional religious communities. And some examples are people who have already been subject to public scrutiny on the basis of their appearance, practices, or adherence to minority religious groups and are at risk of stigmatization. One example with their distinctive appearance and religious practices is the Sikh community, which Sikhs often find themselves at the center of workplace discrimination cases and other controversies involving religious rights. Wearing a turban is not a simply religious symbol, but an essential component of their identity and a mandatory religious principle. Is the expression of religiosity in public sphere jeopardizing secular state laws, or religious norms can be jeopardized by the limitations of the expression of religion and belief? Similar example of boundaries between public and private freedom of religion is related, and we know about debates of Muslim women who had to deal with European context, especially in French, ban of niqab and burqa. So direct influence on religious freedom in public space and how different laws are affecting in practice can be seen from these examples. Another example is indirect discrimination due to the presence of philitism or ethnophilitism, which is a concept and phenomena arose in the 19th century, and it was not present in all countries. However, it has a strong role and impact in Eastern European countries, especially Greece, Romania, Serbia, Bulgaria. And it limits the sense of freedom of religion in a way that favors particular ethnic or national identity of religious groups and creates more divisions and more discrimination of those who do not share the same ethno-religious background. Still, this represents a challenge in many societies where ethnophilitism is present and creates a strong bond between ethnic or national and religious identity and when they are overlapping. Religious buildings and religious symbols also create a space for indirect discrimination and the dynamic relationship between the right to religious liberty and the nature of the public sphere has assumed different forms in European nation states. And this is one of the main debates in the line between the two spheres, between the private, where religious beliefs, identity, and rituals are to be simultaneously constrained and protected, and the public, where the free, rational, diverse are similarly to be constructed and secured. Establishing and maintaining places of worship is an internal component of the right to freedom of religion and belief. Therefore, the challenge is not in presence of recognition of any traditional or predominant religious group values and symbols in public space. Rather, the objection is to the exclusion of restriction on minority religious manifestations or symbols on the basis what is seen as interpretations of norms which appear grounded in majority religious group conceptions. Religious education as well can be a place and a source for indirect discrimination, especially a place for rethinking of the boundaries of freedom of religions and belief. And most commonly in public or state-funded schools, religious education is organized around one particular, usually predominant religious group, and there is a lack of discussion which includes and addresses religious diversity, learning about other religious traditions. This, in a way, monoconfessional perspective of religious education leads to lack of understanding and knowledge about diverse societies we live in from the early age. It is important to recognize that very often we will have children from different religious backgrounds attending majority religious education classes. This leads to violation of the freedom of religion and belief and the need towards inclusive religious education, which will be defocused from the teachings of one single religion tradition perspective. And the list of challenges and possible directions of rethinking freedom of religion and belief in Europe today is much longer. The perception of the freedom of religion through the prism of individual rights is an essential basis of any future action towards raising awareness of the many layers of indirect or hidden discrimination patterns. Discrimination cuts across all the constituting elements of the freedom of religion and belief, and it may be committed by state or non-state actors. The key word in this process is sensibilization of societies on the awareness level of the complex nature of religious identities, which is not a definite or concluded process, but ongoing one. It seems that some religious minorities are on a normative level, free to practice their religion. However, in practice, on a societal level, we are facing rising xenophobia, which leads to harassment, hate speech, proliferation of discriminatory stereotypes, stigmatization, exclusion, and in the end, violence. And following upon significant changes within European society, not least as a consequence of migratory waves from various geographical regions and cultures of the world, the secularist assumption is not being challenged, in particular on the grounds that the requirement that citizens, as well as newcomers and members of religious minorities who wish to participate in society, claim the application of law must be set aside, their beliefs their religious beliefs is discriminatory. To be required to do so likely to create crisis of legitimacy by alienating religious-minded citizens from the formal legal system, thereby rendering it ineffective in practice. And this leads to increased risk of invisibility and segregation. And to conclude, European society cannot underestimate the role played by religious communities in interpreting religious freedom, not just through following a functional approach, but in the light of an established living experience whose legitimacy generally placed beyond mere human will acquire the sort of value per se. Being aware that lack of religious freedom for some religious groups can lead to so-called ghettoization, whereby communities try to protect their religious identity through isolation from the broader environment. If we place an emphasis on the phenomenon of visibility, indirect or hidden discrimination present in European society today, among some religious communities, it is something that is that leads to complexity of their position, especially if we talk about multiple identities of religious minorities. If we talk about minority within minority or double minorities, it is a very space for creation of such ghettoized communities. The need to increase the awareness and change is inevitably present as we face social inclusion and rise of discrimination and xenophobia as a predominant response to the increased diversity in our societies. And even though the notion of religious freedom and respect of religious diversity may sound as a utopian discourse, we need to remind ourselves that many other spheres of minority rights in the past decades advanced in this regard. gender or LGBT rights, people with disabilities, and many others. Why religious minorities can have an equal chance for such challenge, which only can be created with holistic approach, both bottom-up and top-down. And I believe that this conference is a contribution to such discussions and exchanges, and will be an important step towards rethinking about freedom of religion and belief today. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Zurich, also for pointing out how religions could be placed in the minority rights sector, and also how religions are not angels, and sometimes they have also persecuted others, so awareness is very, very important. The floor is now to Professor Peter Petkov from Oxford University.
To be here. I was so delighted to be with you that I was prepared to miss the first day of the celebrations of Her Majesty's Diamond Jubilee. So in the 12 minutes allocated to me, I have been asked to reflect on the state of the art of freedom of religion and belief and beyond. And in intellectual property law, which is one of those things I have to teach for all my sins, there is this notion that the state of the art represents what is, what has been, essentially what we're experiencing now and today. But also it proposes what may be the agenda for change and what are the new trajectories of innovation which we may take on as the next step. So in this 12 minutes, I will look into the ways of summarizing what do I consider to be the state of the art with freedom of religion and belief, and what's likely to change in this complex and delicate concept in the near future. And I consider 3 milestones to be a very important way of seeing what has been happening with freedom of religion and belief in the past few decades. The first is marked by the end of the Cold War, the second by 9/11, and the third by the election of President Trump and the symbolic withdrawal from systemic internationalism. These are not events which reassemble tectonic plates, and yet they are events which are paradigmatically symbolic by the ways they bring together seemingly incompatible ingredients which lead to a profound paradigm shift. The end of the Cold War brought in a big way Article 9 religious freedom jurisprudence to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. Some authors like Malcolm Evans and Javier Martínez-Terón attributed this to the fall of communism and the complex transition of relationship between religion and the state in these new emerging democracies. In fact, while these dramatic changes were taking place in these emerging democracies, they are raising increasingly questions which resonated in the Western Hemisphere, in the old democracies. Individual and community, personal versus corporate autonomy, religious symbols in the public sphere, and those questions started pushing the boundaries in the way we imagine what religious freedom is, but also what religious freedom might be. The early jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights did only consider individual applications. Later, evolution of the jurisprudence began to contemplate religious autonomy and corporate rights as far as religious freedom is concerned. So things remain the same, and yet they were changing as we saw it in the first decade of the post-communist world. Ultimately, the range of questions which imploded in the new member states of the Council of Europe soon resonated with what deeply embedded questions in the West. And while the Council of Europe and the European Union continued to perceive the notion of a lack of a broad-based consensus about the scope of religious freedom, they soon demonstrated common challenges in imagining and enforcing the scope of religious freedom. if we are to compare the cases of the 90s and the cases today emerging in the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights, we could come to the conclusion that Article 9 Strasbourg jurisprudence has grown exponentially. It has changed our perceptions about individual and corporate freedoms, and at the same time has created Article 9 chilling effect, rather than emerging legal culture of substantially good state practices driven by the patterns of intellectually coherent European Court of Human Rights cases. The Brighton Declaration has been a good step forward, seeing a consolidation process of meeting of the concept of neutrality and margin of appreciation, but it's still too early to see the end of the light at the end of the tunnel. The second milestone of the state of the art is 9/11, and what Olivier Roy defines as the revenge of God, coming of religion back into the public sphere, big way, in such a big way that policymakers could only react rather than reflect deeper about what are the consequences of this return. Among other things, 9/11 was a watershed which brought in a very formal fashion religion into sphere of foreign policy. Patterns already apparent in the US foreign policy through the works of the ambassadors at large and the US Commission of International Religious Freedom, the International Religious Freedom Act, made religious freedom a major policy agenda for the US, and was mirrored by emerging patterns in the context of the EU through the engagement of the External Action Service, through the role of the EU Special Envoy, and through the proliferation of religious freedom and voice in almost every European country as we speak today. Religious freedom became a foreign policy agenda of a number of ministerials, initially hosted in the US, subsequently in Poland, and the next ministerial is about to happen in the UK at the beginning of July, and has shaped the agenda of international parliamentarians' partnership of freedom of religion and belief, as well as the agenda of a number of G20 summits, where the agenda of religion and sustainable development has been increasing in visibility. In this context, a new trend has been emerging, driven by what could be described as a clash between a religious freedom approach to foreign policy and a religion and foreign policy approach, championed by scholars like Peter Mandeville. What could be said about this post-9/11 process is a massive investment into interfaith work, religious literacy, and engagement with religious leaders at the level of public policy. In practice, this engagement has produced very little beyond multiple meetings where religious leaders have hugged, kissed, and planned more meetings where they will again hug and kiss. While the post-9/11 world invested heavily in diplomats' religious literacy, it invested very little in developing religions literacy for meaningful policy engagement, and in a sense robbed religious voices from their authentic witness, reducing them to policy endorsement echo chamber. The third trend, which I have chosen to describe as the Trump factor, but it's in fact a trend which resonates in the Brexit narratives, Orban's policies, Erdogan's neo-Ottoman revival, the Cairo Declaration on human rights in Islam, Modi's Hindu nationalism, and Putin's Ruski Mir. This is a process I have defined elsewhere as religious exceptionalism, a trend which on the one hand initiates a traditional concept of American political exceptionalism wrapped with religious packaging to compensate for the lack of independent political institutions, judiciary, free press, and a robust commitment to human rights and the rule of law. This religious exceptionalism justifies unimaginable and unjustifiable political propositions by packaging them as being Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, or whatever, and has a quite prominent, visible place in the international organizations. In other words, instead of exercising human rights, rule of law, and democracy-tempered exceptionalism, which is the traditional premise of political exceptionalism, religious exceptionalism has become a justification to do virtually anything a government chooses to do, as long it has got a religious packaging. It has become a process of consolidation of religious voices in the context of international organizations, and a tactical redrafting of geopolitics by weaponizing of religion as a different factor for articulating a foreign policy agendas. This trend presents opportunities and warning. Opportunities to acknowledge how important is religion for foreign policy analytics, and warnings about the way religious has been gradually weaponized and instrumentalized by increasingly authoritarian political projects. Where does that leave us? Today, more than ever before, we as scholars and people of faith and convictions, we bear great responsibility to see these trends and challenges as gifts as well as dangers they present. More than ever before, we do have the responsibility to keep the religious freedom discourse alive, robust and relevant, and to keep pushing the boundaries of the conversation. Most importantly, we do have an important role to play in making sure that the religious freedom discourses are not hijacked by self-serving agendas. It is terribly important to be able to draw the distinction between the religious freedom violation in connection with conscientious objection in the Northern Hemisphere and the religious freedom of a Christian pastor on a death row in Iran for refusing to renounce Jesus Christ. These are different perspectives, these are different contexts, but these are also completely different ranges, and we have to have a delicate and dynamic understanding of those ranges. The instrumentalization and the weaponization of religious freedom has made tactical engagement with like-minded allies more difficult than 10 years ago. The Article 9 Strasbourg cases of the 90s are now the landmark cases driven by strategic litigation to stress test the system rather than to inquire in a meaningful way about the evolving nature of religious rights under international law. We meet a lot more at different venues. It is more of us now writing on religious freedom, but we tend to say a lot less than we were able to say 10 years ago. We publish a lot more, but as editor of a major international journal of law and religion, I cannot help feeling that the field is actually shrinking. We're reaching a critical juncture where we urgently need to challenge our premises and to confront cheap theology and tactical religious freedom project. And without doing this, we risk debasing and outstripping our normative intuitions and imaginations and making irrelevant important features of our legal cultures. Religious freedom is evoked tactically in culture wars on both sides. It's evoked in Turkey every time museums are converted into mosques, and in India every time a hostile takeover of a mosque takes place. It is invoked on both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and on both sides in the war in Ukraine. This could be done in different ways and in different settings. Decades after the end of the World War II, the ugly head of anti-Semitism has emerged again and often is justified as an exercise of religious freedom or freedom of expression. What can be done about this? There are many things which can be done in different contexts. One way may be to follow the trend of bringing the language of human rights similar to the way this was done through the post-Vatican II concordats of the Holy See. Another way is to get religious actors on board by helping them understand the systemic importance of endorsing human rights rather than endorsing fantasies that religious voices could develop their own bills of rights. There are opportunities to see religious freedom as part of complex ecosystems linked to and overlapping with multiple UN mandates and through the lens of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. There is a scope of building religious freedom of foreign relations memoranda of understanding. But ultimately, there is a scope to work through the acknowledgement that we can no longer deny the deepening of the dialogues between religious and non-religious legal cultures, and the way these dialogues transform each culture at multiple levels and makes old cliches such as secularism, Orientalism, religious establishment, religious disestablishment, or theocracy almost redundant. In this respect, reclaiming a critical sense of history will be crucial, as it will remind religious voices that they were, after all, makers and not just takers of the modern human rights discourse, and cannot deny something which was once theirs. The war in Ukraine was a sobering acknowledgement that several decades of tactical engagement with religious voices and foreign policy created new, dangerous, and at the same time depleted the critical mass for engaging with such challenges. Time has come to cut our losses and consolidate our gifts, that there has not been a better time to do so, and there has not been a better time to do so. There has never been, in modern history, such a broad-based commitment for policy engagement by the political community in the field of law, religion, and politics, backed by a matching volume of excellent scholarship and by positive responses by religious voices. At the same time, there has never been a greater gap between institutions and policy, intuitions and policy responses. Which brings me to the beginning of the topic of this piece. What is the state of the art and what is the beyond? In patent law, we have to demonstrate the state of the art in order to make a leap to something which is novel and represents an inventive step, an industrial application. In the field of religious freedom, we're still stuck in the state of the art, but there is so much energy and possibilities by making the next leap. Metrics for diplomats and policymakers for religion as a factor of foreign policy. A broad-based consensus on the scope of religious freedom protection through a more robust engagement with principles such as neutrality, margin of appreciations, individual and collective autonomy, and last but not least, that religious freedom is not meant to be a sword, but a shield, and in order to be that, we all have a role to play as a shield bearers through our common commitment and co-participation in the articulation of public reason, or if we use Augustine's language, in the shaping of common objects of love. This means that the process of consolidations excludes the possibility that any of us could be simply at the spectators' seats. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to Professor Petkov also for this historical journey and also for remembering us the difference between persecution, intolerance, discrimination, and acknowledging how we are not exempt from losing religious freedom, not only in one context, but globally. And now is the turn to Professor Marco Ventura from Universitat di Siena.
Thank you very much, Miriam. I'm really honored and delighted to be here with you this very special occasion. And I will organize my reflection around three main points, and which are each of them structured as a tension between two poles, two key words. First one is international and local. The second one is religion and belief. And the third one is advocacy and scholarship. And I will then conclude with a suggestion about how to make sense of the tension between these three sets of opposites. International and local. What we experience with freedom of religion or belief is very often, and increasingly so, based on an increasing mass of information and document. We speak of an international standard about freedom of religion or belief, and this is increasingly built with an amount of documents. Some are legally binding, some are not. We have policy documents, and there's a growing, and multiple levels, Sometimes it's international, global international, sometimes it's more regional or like OSCE or Council of Europe or the EU. And we have this international standard emerging, which is cross-national, which is supranational, which is supposed to make sense beyond national borders. And on the other hand, we have an increasing awareness of the local diversities and specificities. We know more, we have more information, not necessarily accurate, but certainly more of it about the local dynamics, the local specificities. This is the first tension which is important for me to share with you and highlight today. We struggle with reconciling the two levels. We have a level of international standard which is necessarily abstract in general, and we have a level of situations on the grounds, or diversity on the ground, a local diversity. And the two worlds are often parallel worlds, and we struggle with them. My second couple, religion or belief, is an example of the first couple. Religion or belief is a formula, is an emerging formula in the international standard, freedom of religion or belief. But what do we know about how that formula is even resented at a local level? How does it even come with local translations? Very little, very little. And we also know that the reason why this formula has been emerging, because this is very inclusive. Religion or belief, the emergence of the formula comes with a sense of inclusion of as many religions as possible, as many beliefs as possible. And this makes sense for the sake of the international conversation on the one hand, but this is very problematic. Well, it is at least very disconnected from how people understand this on the ground. And this is also a very strong challenge for the traditional understanding of freedom of religion without belief in the first place, right? Religious liberty, religious freedom. That came with an identification of religion as a specific, as something which is somehow singled out, as something which is circumscribed, and as something which is in a way or in another prioritized, which deserves a special protection, which is precisely the contrary of why we have this emerging formula of freedom of religion belief, which is rather meant to be all-encompassing, to more or less equate every possible religion or belief to one another, opening the field and avoiding any prioritization. And this is another huge, huge challenge. The first one, the first tension is between advocacy and scholarship. In a international conversation of freedom of religion or belief, we, precisely because we experience some frustration about a real advancement on the ground, precisely because we experience this frustration because we produce more and more documents, we elaborate more and more on the abstract level, but then, you know, what happens on the ground is not, you know, there's no traction, there's no connection. Precisely because of that, we increasing our level of advocacy. We increase the mindset of doing something, having an agenda, pushing for an agenda, thinking of impact. You know, it's a different mindset. And this is growing. And we even see that, without making examples, the selection of experts in international boards, in international organizations, is more and more oriented towards people with an NGO background, with a with a policy or advocacy background, as opposed to previous generations of experts appointed for those roles, which were more the expression of academia and research. And I'm not criticizing this per se. I'm just pointing at a trend. Now, what comes with this trend, with an increasing importance of advocacy, is another disconnect or another tension with scholarships. Okay, scholars have a different mindset. They build on doubts. They when they visit different contexts, they are faced with dilemmas. They are faced with their own limits, cultural and linguistic, to get into what they observe on the ground. And scholarship then is elaborated in a much more dubitative way, in a much more complex way. And there can be tension at both levels. And in the field of religion, especially now, the tension is between a more and more religion or belief-based advocacy and a scholarship which is growing more and more skeptical about even the very possibility to formulate religion as an object of science. Even experts in that's why we open up the field. We say religion and non-religion. And even religion and non-religion, we struggle with even defining, because we gain an awareness with scholarship that those definitions, especially if taken globally, are extremely problematic. Now, a final, my conclusion would be, about how to make sense of these tensions, possibly, how to navigate in this troubled sea. Well, of course, I started with information and communication as a very, very important angle. I think that the fact that this initiative is stemming from a great work on communication and religion at Blanquerna Institute is not by chance. Is not by chance. Well, for all the many great things that Miriam and her staff have been doing, sort of on a more subjective level, there's an object. I mean, the great idea was to connect freedom of religion and belief and a work on communication and religion. This is extremely important. And the second thing I take from a conversation I had a couple of weeks ago with a Catalan philosopher, Josep Maria Esquirol. I had a conversation online with him, and I then published it in an Italian newspaper on his recent book, Umano mas Humano. We were discussing on a different level. And in the book and in the conversation, his strong point was, we need distinctions, we don't need separation. And I thought that, well, the conversation was on a completely different level. But I thought that this approach suggested by Esquirol could be a way, could be, a good direction, a good methodology, a good approach with these three couples. We need to distinguish the three of them, the different levels. We need to have a very acute mind when it comes to distinguishing those levels in order to understand each of them better, and to understand better and work better at how they can be articulated. At the same time, thinking of separating those would be very detrimental, would be very negative. So this is how I would conclude. More distinction, less separation, in the name of a Catalan philosopher. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor Ventura, and all of you also for introducing concrete examples, not only theoretical background. Thank you for introducing the difference and the tension. We love tension. We love the problems on the table between advocacy and research. And as you know, Catalans are everywhere. So we're also happy that you discovered Professor Esquirol in Italy. So now it's the turn for Professor Cyril Hovorun from the Stockholm Academy of Theology. Thank you.
Thank you so much. While representing the Stockholm School of Theology, I'm also Ukrainian, and I thought that it is an excellent opportunity to, first of all, to express the gratitude of the entire kind of Ukrainian community residing here in Catalonia. I know some people from this community, the refugees, and I know how they have been helped by the local people, by the Catalonians, and by the Generalitat de Catalunya. It was, well, the help was immense, incredible, and we are very grateful to all of you for that. Also, I think that this meeting is an excellent opportunity also to address some issues pertinent to the ongoing war in Ukraine. This war has many aspects, many sides, and religious freedom, religious plurality is one of those aspects, as a matter of fact. And if we zoom in on that aspect of the war, we will see really an antagonism between two mentalities, two philosophies regarding religious pluralism and religious diversity. On the one hand, there is a mentality of monopolization of the religious field, coming from Russia, from the perpetrator in the war. And unfortunately, my own church, kind of the Russian Orthodox Church to which I belonged, is a protagonist of this monopolization of the religious field, being helped by the Russian government and the Kremlin. And essentially, there is a deal, I would say, between the church and the Kremlin. The Kremlin uses the services of the church, especially in providing ideology, the ideological framework for the war, and as a reward, the Kremlin gives the church a chance to reestablish a monopoly in the religious field in Russia and on the occupied territories, which I'm going to discuss briefly in my presentation. On the other side of the war, of the divide, there is another culture and another philosophy and another mentality, if you want, the mentality of the Ukrainian people in Ukraine. And I think that one of the, if you want, one of the emerging features of the national identity in Ukraine nowadays is exactly the idea of cherishing diversity, religious diversity. Yes, Ukraine is predominantly Orthodox. The majority of the Ukrainians identify themselves with the Orthodox churches. There are some churches, and they feature, I mean, the Orthodox, they feature their own diversity between the jurisdictions, and actually the coexistence of jurisdictions, I think, helps the Orthodox to appreciate diversity. Then there are minority groups in Ukraine. The most important minority is the Greek Catholic Church, which is a part of the Catholic Church. There is also a Roman Catholic minority in Ukraine, and then there are evangelical groups, quite many of them, more traditional Protestant denominations, and other religious groups. The most important, well, the most numerous of other religions is Islam, present mostly in Crimea, in the occupied peninsula of Crimea, and then the Jewish minority. So essentially, the ongoing war is a huge challenge for preserving the diversity, the religious diversity in Ukraine. And I should say that this war started not in February 2022, on the 24th of February 2022, but it started actually in February 2014, when in the aftermath of the Maidan, the Revolution of Dignity, what we call the Revolution of Dignity, Putin waged a proxy war against Ukraine, annexed Crimea, and started a proxy war in Donbass area, which is the east of Ukraine. Now, probably you know the Ukrainian toponymy better than me from the news. I don't need to explain that toponymy and where is the east, where is the west of Ukraine. from the beginning of this encroachment of Russia upon the Ukrainian soil, we faced the challenge of religious diversity from the very beginning, from 2014. I think the first victim of the Russian aggression fell Crimea. There were thriving Muslim communities in Crimea, which were also Tatar communities. Tatars is a group of an ethnic group that lived in Crimea for centuries. They suffered from the deportation under Stalin in 1943. They were accused of alleged collaboration with the Nazis and were deported by Stalin as a nation. As a result, that nation was decimated. They died in the exile, and only after the Ukrainian independence they received the chance of coming back to Ukraine. So they had a short period of peaceful time in Crimea where they could reestablish themselves, and then the Russians came, and the Tatars again faced the challenge of being deported, of being persecuted, and indeed many of them were persecuted severely. Some of them disappeared, some of them were tortured, some of them were, well, killed, and their bodies were identified. The Russians substituted the kind of free Muslim organizations, free Muslim groups with controlled groups. Those who did not comply with the Russian occupation were either exiled or had to go underground. At the same time, in 2014, with the encroachment of Russia upon the eastern Ukrainian region of Donbass, the religious minorities suffered again. It's quite a surprise that the eastern part of Ukraine, before the occupation, had more evangelical Protestant communities than even the Orthodox communities, for different reasons. But that is a matter of fact. And those evangelical communities suffered most. Some of their pastors were, again, tortured, killed, burned alive. There were reports in the international media about those cases. And again, the monopoly of the Moscow Patriarchate was established, being supported by the Russian bayonets and guns. And some theological institution, like there was a prominent, a very kind of really important educational institution for the evangelicals in Donetsk, the Ukrainian Christian University. So when the Russians took over, they just purged everything there. They burned the Bibles, they burned the library of that university, and they established their casernes there. So it happened as early as 2014. With the new situation, with the new war, well, the kind of escalation, we call it not the new war, but the escalation of this war, that was like a slow war for 8 years. With the escalation of the war in February 2022, new challenges came from the perspective of religious diversity. The situation is that the Russians come to those areas where they occupy the new areas of Ukraine that they occupy, and they try to establish again the monopoly of the Moscow Patriarchate in those areas. The situation is has been complicated by the developments in between. In 2018, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was established as an autocephalous church. That the kind of diversity of the Orthodox jurisdictions that I mentioned in my presentation earlier was reduced to two jurisdictions essentially. One is the jurisdiction of the Moscow Patriarchate, which constitutes the majority of the churches, and another one is the jurisdiction, the autocephalous independent jurisdiction, which was granted, was recognized as independent by the Ecumenical Patriarchate in January 2019. So there was a rivalry between the two jurisdictions, well, this rivalry had both positive and negative sides. The negative side, of course, was that they did not reconcile. They did not want to reconcile. The positive side was that there was a competition between the Orthodox jurisdictions, which taught the Orthodox to appreciate diversity. With the war, escalated in February 2022, the Moscow Patriarchate was accused of collaborating with the Russians, and indeed there were cases of such a collaboration, for which reason the Moscow Patriarchate became quite ostracized within the Ukrainian society, and found itself under the pressure from the Ukrainian society to choose the side, to be with the Ukrainian people or with the Moscow Patriarchate. Of course, sometimes those accusations were not justifiable, were made in wholesale when the entire jurisdiction, entire body of the Orthodox were accused of doing the same things, which was not true, because the majority of the Moscow Patriarchate Ukrainians still supported the Ukrainian cause and, you know, were for the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian victory and so forth. Nevertheless, as a jurisdiction, they came under the pressure, and there was a challenge of what to do with this jurisdiction on the local level. In the regions of Ukraine, there was a movement of banning, prohibiting the Moscow Patriarchate altogether in some regions, which was a doubtful practice from the legal perspective. However, on the national level, the state did not proceed to prohibiting the Moscow Patriarchate. They decided to leave it kind of as it is. At the same time, from the society, from the local, from the grassroots level, so to say, the pressure was increasing, and as a result of this pressure, the Moscow Patriarchate met just a few days ago on the 27th of May and decided actually to, in a hidden way, implicit way, to proclaim its independence from Moscow, which was a huge step from Moscow, away from Moscow, and towards the reconciliation with the Autocephalous Church. So we see how the things are changing in Ukraine under the pressure of the circumstances, primarily under the pressure of the war. And even though sometimes the situation is really balancing on the verge of tolerance, in the situation of the war, one would argue that probably the principles of tolerance don't always work and are not always respected, but in Ukraine they are still respected. And I think the Ukrainian society has not crossed the red line of tolerance regarding even the Moscow Patriarchate, which has been accused of collaboration. At the same time, the situation is correcting to the point of preserving the religious diversity, and at the same time towards reconciliation between different groups in Ukraine. Now we can speak about, and I'm concluding, about the situation when the entire Ukrainian society is consolidated in repulsing the aggressor, the perpetrator, consolidated in around the Ukrainian cause, the Ukrainian victory. All the differences that existed before, including the difference between the religious groups, are more or less overcome and kind of pushed aside. Of course, after the victory, we hope that the victory will come. The old kind of controversies will reemerge again, but I think as a society we will reemerge as a strong society, appreciating our diversity, our differences, or our distinctions rather than differences. So our differences will become our distinctions, and yeah, so I think we are on good track, and as a society, regardless of the situation, regardless of the war, and I hope that this kind of initiative of the Blanquerna Observatory can also help us as the Catalonian people help Ukrainian refugees, so this observatory, this initiative may help our society to keep on this track of appreciating diversity and pluralism. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Professor Hoburn, and thanks for speaking out and clearly. You know, sometimes in religious freedom agoras, we speak with so sensitivity without trying to harm the others, and it's important to speak out. When I told him that we were very worried 2 months ago for the situation, he answered me, "It is not a situation, Miriam, it's war. It's war." So sometimes we're just being so subtle, not offending the others, and we need to speak out, and thank you very much for that. We have 5 minutes for questions, and then you have 25 minutes if you want to bother them without coffee for questions out there. So the floor is yours. You are so silent, so I guess there is no questions. A lot of reflection inside you. So we could meet over there for 30 minutes, and then all the panels are in this building in different rooms. So very welcome again. Thank you.